Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the Leuven Seminar in Classical German Philosophy. And today we will be discussing a pre-circulated paper by Stefano Bacin on Kant's rejection of universal practical philosophy. The paper is available on the website of the Leuven seminar. I can post here the link for those who haven't read it yet. And I'll do it in a moment. And Stefano Bacin is our speaker today. He's Associate Professor of History of Philosophy at the Università degli Studi di Milano. His main areas of interest are Kant and Kantian ethics, history of ethics, ethical theory, classical German philosophy, British idealism, and pragmatism. He's the author of several publications on practical philosophy, especially in Kant and Fichte. He co-edited, for instance, with Owen Ware, Fichte's System of Ethics, a critical guide published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. He's also co-editor of the Emergence of Autonomy in Kant's Moral Philosophy, also by Cambridge University Press in 2019. And among his several journal articles, I mentioned two on Kant's practical philosophy that are maybe relevant to our discussion today. The Fate of Autonomy in Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, published in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy recently in 2022. And The Error in the Groundwork, Kant's revision of the imperatives and prudence as technical ability in Studia Kantiana in 2019. So we are very happy to receive you here today, Stefano. And as a respondent to Stefano's talk, we will have Natalia Palatnik. She's assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin. She works mostly on Kant's moral philosophy, and she has several publications on this topic, among which I mentioned some that might also be relevant to the discussion. Kantian Freedom at a Distance in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy, also in 2022. Towards the Highest Good, Endless Progress and Its Totality in Kant's Moral Argument for the Postulate of Immortality in the Journal of Transcendental Philosophy, 2022. Kantian Agents and Their Significant Orders in the Kantian Review, and The Ideal of the Highest Good and the Objectivity of Moral Judgment in Kant Yearbook. So many Kant articles in very good journals. And we're also happy to have you here today, Natalia. And the structure of our discussion will be so that Stefano will briefly introduce the paper for about 10 minutes. Natalia's response will take 8 to 10 minutes. Stefano will then have the opportunity to reply to the response, about 3 to 5 minutes. And then we will open the floor for discussion with the audience, and this will take about 50 minutes to 60. After the session, we will leave the Zoom open for informal conversations, and you are all warmly welcome to stay. And without further ado, I give the floor to Stefano Bacin, who will present his paper titled Not a Will of Any Particular Kind, Kant's Rejection of Universal Practical Philosophy. Stefano, thank you for being here today. The floor is yours.
Well, many thanks. In the first place, thanks for having me, and thanks to you and to Natalia in the first place for the attention you've given to my draft, to the draft we're discussing today. So I'm just very grateful to all of you. As advertised, I'm just giving a very brief outline of a paper which is actually rather brief and rather compact in itself. As you know, even if you haven't read the paper, topic of the topic at issue is, well, are those remarks that we find at almost at the end of the preface of the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, where Kant, well, suggests or stresses that his own project, well, the Metaphysics of Morals, has to be differentiated and not to be, has to be distinguished from the traditional project of a universal practical philosophy. My interest in that, well, basically my paper is a comment or tries to suggest how how we should comment and understand that one paragraph at the end of the preface of the groundwork. And my interest in those remarks grew out as, as it mostly happens, of the dissatisfaction with what I was reading about those remarks in the literature. I suppose the same applies to most of us when we decide to focus on a specific topic, because we are just, well, we remain puzzled in spite of everything we read about that passage or about that the concept of that claim. And we find there a couple of remarks that are clearly supposed to be very important to Kant, if only because of the place and the position they have in the work. Just at the beginning, where the author tries to clarify what it's all about, and what kind of project should be started there. And well, in spite of the, well, clear importance, the clear significance that those remarks are supposed to have, what we find in the literature is rather, well, as disappointing, in the sense that it seems to downplay, or it seems to me at least to downplay that significance, because, well, mostly those remarks, which I will refer to more clearly in a minute, are well reduced to one or two rather qualified criticism against Wolff about a specific point. And well, even before getting to the substance of the remarks, such a reading seems to me methodologically inadequate, if only because a couple of lines into the paragraph, Kant writes that difference, the difference between his own project and the universal practical philosophy, well, should explain why he intends to open up an entirely new field. That is the phrase he uses. Well, so what we should understand then is the reasons why, or is the reason why Kant intends to open up an entirely new field. So my comment, or my interpretive proposal on that paragraph first focuses on the target of the criticism, then tries to focus on the specific meaning of those criticisms, and then adds a few remarks on the implications of those critical remarks. First, the target. Well, I mean, it may sound weird that I spend so much time and so much effort in suggesting that we have to, well, focus much more clearly what the target of those remarks is, if only because, well, Kant writes it. Well, just to read the beginning of the paragraph, Kant writes there, let it not be thought that what is here called for already exists in the guise of the propedeutic of the famous Wolff for his moral philosophy, namely that which he called universal practical philosophy. I mean, the target is there, Wolff and the universal practical philosophy. A reader can grow a bit more suspicious, though, because a few lines later, Kant writes the authors in the plural of that science. So we have at least two possible readings as far as the target of the remarks is concerned. Namely, the remarks can be just about Wolff, universal practical philosophy, namely at least a couple of works, the first part of the Deutsche Ethik and the first and both parts of the Philosophia Practica Universalis in the Latin system. And of course, second option, a bit wider reading, we can understand under that that Kant, well, also addresses the Wolffians in general, Baumgarten in the first place, Meyer and as well. So those writers in the Wolffian area who we have in the last couple of decades much more appreciated as to the role they had for the development of Kant's thought. Well, the reading I propose is of a third kind, namely, the target is in fact broader as far as my proposal goes. Namely, universal practical philosophy means there for Kant what the phrase universal practical philosophy meant back then for every German philosopher, namely a specific philosophical discipline, independently from specific claims, as a specific, well, philosophical direction for independently from specific philosophical views. It is a philosophical discipline, as we would say when we speak about metaethics or something like that. We are not addressing only a specific view or specific family of views in metaethics. We're addressing metaethics in general. So my first claim is, and we have textual grounds for my proposal. I won't go into that right now. Otherwise, I'm speaking too much and too long. We have specific textual grounds for suggesting that what Kant is addressing there is an entire philosophical discipline, as that discipline was conceived of back then in German philosophical debate at the end of the 18th century. And that alone gives those remarks, those two remarks, well, a broader significance, makes them immediately more interesting. It's not only about, well, what Kant was dissatisfied about in Wolff. It was about, well, opening up a new field, just conceiving of the entire project of moral philosophy in a different way. Well, and this brings, well, how different? And this brings me rather quickly to the second point, namely, what about the meaning and the scope of those remarks? Well, for the purpose of, for the sake of clarity, we can distinguish two main remarks in that paragraph. I dub them the motivating grounds point and logic point. It will be clear in a minute why I dub them that way. First, I'm saying now that for the sake of clarity, we should consider that paragraph in the preface of the groundwork encompasses 2 points, if only because most commentators, I think almost everyone I'm aware of that who has ever written on those pages, has only considered the first one, the motivating grounds point. There Kant writes that, well, universal practical philosophy is to be rejected or is, well, inadequate because it didn't consider a specific kind of will, a particular kind of will, namely pure will. It did consider only, merely, well, willing in general, independently, without taking into account what the motivating grounds of the will are. And that sort of formulation has led most interpreters to, well, understand those remarks in a rather narrow way, or in a, according to, or giving them a rather narrow scope, namely, well, it's all about motivation, or at best, it's all about, well, understanding obligation properly, because we know, or we will know in a couple of pages further, that Kant proposes to understand motivation and obligation differently, with specific reference to a specific kind of motivating grounds, well, non-empirically conditioned, but pure. Well, we can see those remarks as anticipating those points. And, well, the reading, that sort of reading is too narrow to me, if only because, well, it's not enough to reject an entire philosophical discipline, an entire philosophical project for the foundations of morality. Well, it's rather about, and this is my suggestion, about the role the foundations of moral philosophy should give to an examination of the will, specifically. The broader significance of those remarks becomes clearer to my mind, or to my eyes, if we consider the second remark, what I dubbed the logic point. The logic point goes roughly as follows. Well, in considering only willing in general, universal practical philosophy proceeds analogously to general logic in the theoretical theoretical philosophy, and precisely for, well, analogous reasons, we should distinguish a new project whose difference from universal practical philosophy is that, well, it relates to universal practical philosophy precisely like transcendental logic relates to general logic. So, and that remark, which as far as I know, is, well, almost entirely neglected in the literature, as weird as may sound, and it still sounds weird to me, at least. Well, it gives a much more precise idea of, well, the broad significance of Kant's critical remarks, and strongly suggests that his dissatisfaction with universal practical philosophy is not about specific claims. It's about, well, the entire outlook, the entire perspective of philosophical discipline. Well, the idea would be then that just like universal practical philosophy, just like general logic only considers rules of thinking in general, without any relation to, well, to the matter of cognition, to the matter of knowledge, and to objects in the first place. Just like that, universal practical philosophy only deals with willing in general. While, and that's of course the counterpart we are most interested in, while a proper foundation for moral philosophy should go the other way, just like transcendental philosophy, transcendental logic analyzes, examines our faculty, our cognitive faculties, insofar as they relate to object of knowledge and relate a priori to object of knowledge. Well, just like that, just analogously, proper foundations for moral philosophy should consider not willing in general, but a pure will, namely a will, well, insofar as it plays a foundational role for morality, insofar as it gives a standard of judgment, insofar as it allows to clarify what the grounds of moral obligations are. Just a couple of minutes for two last points. What I find particularly important here is that, well, as I said, the logic point gives, to my mind, the most important clue. And this is also clarified by an important parallel that I would like to stress with an all-important passage in a draft, in one of Kant's drafts for the Prolegomena, basically just a few months before he began to write the groundwork, where he, well, it's a rather famous passage, where he underscores what he calls the auffallende Ähnlichkeit, the striking similarity between the fundamental problem of theoretical philosophy, how are synthetic a priori claims possible, propositions possible, and, well, the fundamental problem for moral philosophy. The drafter doesn't elaborate on that very much further, but well, every reader of the groundwork knows what is that about? Well, that's about the idea that the key issue is to clarify how is a categorical imperative as a synthetic a priori practical proposition possible. So, and that should explain why we should, well, jettison once and for all anything that even is even similar, that is even close to universal practical philosophy, because we need a totally different starting point for the foundations of moral philosophy. Only one last remark about the implication, then every further detail can be given and clarified in the Q&A, I suppose. One of the main reasons, or the main and many reasons why I find this remarks extremely important, or extremely important to my own understanding of Kant's moral philosophy and its project in general, is that those remarks amount to what I call an anti-constitutivist point, which is to me particularly significant, especially now when so many, well, many accurate and expert and interesting interpreters of Kant's moral philosophy propose to read him as a constitutivist, namely, especially in the of the kind of agency constitutivism, namely as a philosopher who puts forward a view according to which it's an examination of the structures, of the constitutive structures of agency that allows us to find out, to discover the constitutive norms of agency. And so the foundations of moral normativity. And, well, that is precisely what Kant seems to reject in that paragraph, and that makes it to me even more interesting, and also explains probably in a way, but this is in a way metacritical, if you want, also this sort of interpretive tendency explains also why that paragraph is so well, I would say misunderstood or neglected in a way, because, well, what constitutivists as such, well, Korsgaard, in the wake of Korsgaard, if you want, from Korsgaard to Karl Schäfer, what constitutivists as such aim to do, or Andy Reid, to mention a prominent example, is exactly to, well, examine, to analyze what they call rational willing in general, including, well, willing according to hypothetical imperatives and so on, and prudential reasoning and so on, to, well, let emerge to identify what they take to be the foundations of moral normativity specifically. But that's precisely what Kant is rejecting there. So that is, starting from rather historical perspective about what is the actual target of Kant's remarks, I would try to suggest that has interesting philosophical implications for us nowadays, both in Kant literature and probably a bit broader. But that's it. I've probably talked too long. Thanks for your patience.
Hey, thank you so much, Stefano, for this very interesting introduction. And I now give the floor to Natalia Palatnik. Natalia, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. So again, first of all, I want to thank Stefano for this excellent, insightful, really thought-provoking paper. And I also want to thank Karen for organizing these seminars and for inviting me to respond to Stefano's paper. I have learned a lot from it, and I find Stefano's interpretation really attractive, and I'm inclined to agree with most of what he says here. So my comments will mostly invite him to clarify certain points and to connect his interpretation of what Kant says about universal practical philosophy and the groundwork with some of his later methodological remarks. So I did prepare a little summary, but I'm not going to do that because I think Stefano already beautifully summarized what the paper is about. So just dive into some of these comments and questions. So first of all, according to Stefano, the most revealing observation in the paragraph in the groundworks preface that he is considering is what he calls the logic point. And again, the logic point highlights the difference between Kant's own project and universal practical philosophy, generally understood, by drawing the analogy with the theoretical realm. So more specifically, the logic point says that the universal practical philosophy differs from metaphysics of morals, Kant's project, in the same way that general logic differs from transcendental philosophy. Now, it seems to me that this analogy between two relations that Kant is drawing there is somewhat ambiguous with respect to what it suggests about the relationship between universal practical philosophy and Kant's investigation into the foundations of morals. One thing that Stefano argues is that Kant really wants to reject the entire discipline of universal practical philosophy, and that there is not any kind of continuity between these two projects. But two disciplines can be quite different from each other and yet coexist, in some sense, even be in some way connected. So I think the analogy is a bit ambiguous in this way. So on the one hand, it can be taken to show, as Stefano argues, that Kant denies any similarity and hence any kind of continuity between universal practical philosophy and his own project. And Kant can be taken to reject the former's method, its presuppositions, perhaps its achievements entirely. On the other hand, it seems to me that Kant's analogy also allows for some sort of coexistence, as it were, and even some kind of limited continuity between universal practical philosophy, granted, properly limited and rectified, and Kant's project of the foundations of morals. After all, despite the fact that general logic and transcendental philosophy are very different kinds of inquiries, Kant does not reject the method or the achievements of general logic as a legitimate kind of inquiry, as long as it stays within its proper bounds. But more importantly, in the first critique, Kant takes general logic, in particular, its analysis of the forms of judgments, to provide a clue to the discovery of pure concepts and operations of the understanding and transcendental logic. So an account of operations and rules of general logic even serves a certain useful function, so to speak, in the critical investigation into the concepts and rules of transcendental philosophy. So in light of this, Kant's analogy in the preface of the groundwork seems to allow, at least, and might even suggest, that Kant does not have an entirely negative view of universal practical philosophy. If the latter stands to Kant's own inquiry into the foundations of morals, in the way general logic stands to transcendental philosophy, and Kant's analogy, again, at least doesn't deny and may even suggest this, then it doesn't seem unreasonable to think, as Henry Allison does, for example, that Kant acknowledges some merit in universal practical philosophy, or at least of some merit of some rectified, limited version of it, as merely a preparation for the metaphysics of morals rather than its foundational element. So I would like to hear Stefano's thoughts on whether and why this aspect of Kant's analogy should be set aside. Because I think that maybe Allison, when he suggests some sort of limited continuity, maybe he's latching on that aspect. Okay. My next question concerns Stefano's claim that the magnitude of Kant's structure with universal practical philosophy announced in the groundwork is also confirmed by the fact that there is no further discussion of universal practical philosophy in his later writings. The point, if I understand it correctly, is that once the general approach of universal practical philosophy is shared by all other moral philosophers working at the time, is decisively set aside by Kant in the preface to the groundwork, there is, in a sense, no reason to return to that criticism. But I wonder if Kant's extensive discussion of his method in the critique of practical reason might lead one to doubt this conclusion, as well as perhaps Stefano's more important claim about the broad scope of significance of Kant's remarks against universal practical philosophy in the groundwork. But in his discussion of the paradox of method in the analytic of second critique, Kant draws a sharp distinction between his own critical method and a general approach of all previous inquiries into the foundations of morals. More specifically, Kant suggests that by starting from the substantive concept of the good, defined independently of and prior to the a priori moral law, all other theories exclude from the start the possibility of even thinking of a priori practical laws and end up with empirical a posteriori principles inadequate to the categorical nature of morality. So his own method, Kant argues, is the only proper method of establishing that supreme principle. These remarks, he adds, are important for they, quote, explain at once the occasioning ground of all the errors of philosophers with respect to the supreme principle of morals. Right? So he clearly puts everyone in that other camp. And he includes in that camp of methodologically mistaken philosophers, not just moral philosophers working at that time, but also notably the ancients. Now, in this discussion, if this discussion is supposed to diagnose the source of all the errors of the other philosophers attempting to ground morality, just as Kant's criticism of universal practical philosophy is supposed to do in the groundwork on Stefano's view, then clearly Kant didn't think that the issue was settled once and for all with his remarks at the start of the groundwork. And if he didn't think that this issue was fully settled and took the name universal practical philosophy as a stand-in for the program shared by all other moral philosophers working on the foundations of morals at the time, then it seems a little bit suspicious that he doesn't mention universal practical philosophy here at all. And relatedly, while in this part of the second critique, Kant explicitly distinguishes his method from a broader philosophical tradition, including the ancients, again, in the groundwork, he explicitly mentions only and specifically Wolff's propedeutic, right, or quote, Wolff's propedeutic, namely what he calls universal practical philosophy and the authors working in that science, even though he also briefly mentions ancient Greek philosophy at the start of the preface. This at least raises a question in my mind, at least, about the scope of significance of Kant's remark in the groundwork. If Kant's point was entirely general, why wouldn't Kant be more explicit about this instead of mentioning Wolff and writers in that science in particular? More generally, I would like to invite Stefano to share his thoughts on the relationship between Kant's remarks against universal practical philosophy in the groundwork and his methodological reflections in later works, particularly his discussion of the paradox of method in the second critique. Because there seems to be some sort of relationship, and would be interesting to see exactly how that relationship should be fleshed out. And sort of relatedly to that, Kant's discussion of the paradox of method raises another question for Stefano's reading, I think. Stefano suggests that Kant's rejection of universal practical philosophy in the groundwork implies that his project is based on a general anti-constitutivist assumption, right? That's a big implication of this historical discussion, that a merely descriptive preliminary inquiry into the nature of agency or the nature of our rational faculties cannot ground normative principles. Right? This is a really significant point, because it really, if Stefano is right, then all these constituents of Kant, including those by Korsgaard, Dries, and Schaeffer more recently, they're all missing something really important. They're misinterpreting, really, Kant, right? And all the neo-Kantian constitutive projects are really fundamentally un-Kantian. So that's important. But the paradox of method discussion does not seem to make or to imply such a kind of general claim, general anti-constitutivist claim. Rather, Kant argues there that we cannot arrive at pure practical laws by starting with some substantive concept of the good, whose definition would have to draw on empirical concepts, and then looking for principles that promote this good, excuse me. So given that Kant doesn't argue for the general anti-constitutivist assumption and doesn't explicitly state it, why would we think that he holds it in that general form? In other words, it doesn't seem clear to me that Kant's anti-constitutivist point impugns constitutivism in general, or that constitutivist readings of Kant that don't follow the pattern described as problematic in the paradox of method discussion, which I think the later versions of perhaps Korsgaard's work, and Reed's and Schaeffer's in particular, don't seem to clearly fit into that group or follow that problematic pattern. So it doesn't seem clear to me that Kant's constitutivist point impugns constitutivism in general, or constitutivist readings of Kant that don't follow this pattern, or that those constitutivist readings of Kant that don't follow that pattern are indeed in breach of Kant's fundamental commitment. So again, I would like to invite Stefano to say a bit more about the implications of his view for constitutivist readings of Kant. So I think I used up my time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Natalia, for these very stimulating questions. Stefano, the floor is yours.
Well, yes, let me first thank Natalia for your very sharp and very helpful comments. So really, I really mean it, very insightful and very accurate. So I'll try to respond to them as well as pointedly as I can. Well, the first general point you made, it's about well, continuity, or the fact that we should we should in fact recognize some continuity. And then there I totally agree with you. I mean, you're just right. And this is probably more of a matter of tone and emphasis in my exposition. I mean, I just wanted, and I still want to emphasize the discontinuity, of course, as you got it. I mean, also because of methodological reasons, in fact. Allow me here a very quick digression. I mean, in many cases, I would almost say in most cases, but let's say in many cases, some attention to Kant's predecessors or to Kant's contemporaries yields some idea of continuity. And it doesn't have to be. I mean, we have to. We just, as interpreters, we have to properly focus who Kant was discussing with. But that doesn't mean that it just simply takes over, and goes on the same path other of his contemporaries or his predecessors were working on. So in this, also for these reasons, I wanted to and still aim to stress, to underscore, first of all, discontinuity. Of course, that doesn't mean that, and here you're not only totally right, but you're also very helpful to me in encouraging me, in suggesting me to recall and to explicitly clarify that it doesn't mean that the discipline or the approach Kant was trying to, well, distance himself from was to be just entirely forgotten. And you're right, the logic point is particularly clear and important also because of that, because of course Kant never even dreamt of just forget general logic once and for all. And you're totally right. I mean, universal practical philosophy is probably, I would dare to say, in this aspect, not as important as general logic in this aspect. Although, of course, I'm totally prepared to say, and I will clarify that in the next version of the paper, that Kant is, of course, prepared to take over specific claims, specific achievements, specific results of universal practical philosophy. I mean, I even quote in the paper an otherwise puzzling remark in the Mronkovius 2 lectures, where Kant is reported to have said to his students, "Allgemein praktische Philosophie wird hier mitgenommen. Sofern sie eine Vorbereitung abgibt." I mean, universal practical philosophy is here, well, taken over in a way, insofar as it provides a propedeutic. And this remark, well, should be read probably in two ways. In the very idea of a propedeutic to moral philosophy was incredibly important as such. It's just the way it was developed that it was entirely wrong. And in spite of that second dimension of that of continuity, of course, specific claims, specific results in the examination of willing in general do remain important. Its entire outlook that remains nevertheless entirely mistaken and entirely, well, misguided, not mistaken, but misguided. But totally right about continuity. Even more interesting, after the groundwork, I have to confess my original paper, or the previous version of my paper, had a further section after the groundwork, but I didn't just have the time to, well, make that clearer and to polish it, in a way. But you're totally right. I mean, when I suggest that after the 1785, universal practical philosophy is not an open issue anymore to Kant, that doesn't mean that the methodological contrast is just forgotten. Well, I do mean to underscore the mere fact, the matter of fact that universal practical philosophy is not even mentioned anymore until the introduction to the metaphysics of morals, about which I say something. But about the second critique, then this is the most interesting point. I take it. I see the presence of the same contrast in a rather different way than you are suggesting. Namely, it's not so much about the issue discussed in the paradox of method. It's rather about for Kant, something more fundamental, namely, well, basically, it's what surfaces in the annotation to section 3 in the first chapter of the second critique, namely where Kant addresses the general idea of distinguishing higher faculty of desire and lower faculty of desire, and criticizes the point. And well, he writes something like, it's even surprising that in clever people like Wolf and Baumgarten proposes something like that. Although, if we really like to, or we intend to take over again, this is a specific element of continuity, for instance, that distinction between higher faculty of desire and lower faculty of desire, well, it's perfectly appropriate if we take it to mean, well, the distinction between pure practical reason and practical reason as empirical conditions, which is basically exactly the same point in positive terms that he made in the preface to the groundwork against universal practical philosophy. So in a way, we do have to, well, gain something from universal practical philosophy, reconstruing it in the proper light and seeing it as conceptual tool to, well, argue for proper for the appropriate claims. I'm not that convinced about the relation with the paradox of methods, and if only because, I mean, for two reasons. The paradox of methods, which is, of course, incredibly important and incredibly crucial for a proper understanding of Kant's view, not only in the second critique, but in general, is nevertheless about a crucial but specific issue, namely, how should we determine the notion, the meaning of the notion of good, and what is the order in the investigation? Moral concepts or moral predicates first and the moral standard after that, or the other way around. And I have to say, I don't see, as of now, a direct link between the very idea of universal practical philosophy as an examination of willing in general with the specific thought to, well, begin to develop moral philosophy by defining the fundamental moral predicates. Of course, well, in many cases, the two projects came together. For instance, Wolf does something like that when he defines good and bad in the first part of the German ethics. But I mean, it doesn't have to be. Namely, we could probably say that paradox of method is a an even more general point, which doesn't address only authors writing in your working on universal practical philosophy. It's has a rather difficult focus. And this second part of your very appropriate suggestion, this could explain why constitutivists like Reed, for instance, are more than willing to take in to follow the idea of a paradox of method, even more crucial to someone like Andy in his interpretation of Kant, because, well, it moves away from any form of moral realism as we understand it, well, in broader terms nowadays. And it also, because of that, is totally compatible with a certain sort of agency constitutivism. But also because of that, I suppose, we could see that those are, in a way, rather different problems or rather different issues. Although you are right, again, in pointing out that probably when I suggest that universal practical philosophy is rejected in general terms, and when I explain why it still the same still applies to the second critique, I have to clarify how that relates to the paradox of method. That's certainly true. I mean, one quick way to respond to that is that, well, there are many layers, many aspects of what Kant calls method in moral philosophy. I mean, just think of the doctrinal method at the end of the second critique, which is in turn about different problems and different issues, and still is about method for him. And probably I still have to say something about one further point you made, namely, why not be more explicit? At some point, you suggested that Kant should have been or could have been more explicit if the point was really meant to be that general and to address that, well, to that fundamental. Well, I mean, what a man can do, after all. I mean, he was rather explicit, and also a couple of examples that I gave in the paper are aimed to show that, well, basically all of Kant's contemporaries back then followed the same pattern. They referred to universal practical philosophy as a philosophical discipline. Basically, every time they say which we owe to the great Wolf and which is Wolf's great merit and so on and so on, and then they just, well, they don't talk about Wolf or some Wolfian idea in general. They discuss specific topics in universal practical philosophy, precisely I mean, as we could do when we say, well, let's talk about hermeneutics, which we owe to the great Gadamer and so on and so on. But we don't have to talk about Gadamer, to discuss Gadamer directly. We can discuss one of the many other writers working on hermeneutics in a way in the wake of the Gadamer. So to my eyes, it was those remarks are rather explicit, but I'll try to be even more explicit about how explicit they are. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. So
okay, I won't reply again. So I'll let
we can
raise questions.
Yeah, we can leave you some time to do that as well. But we will now open the floor for some questions, and then at the end, if we have some time, then I can give you the word again, if it's fine with you. Okay, very good. So Sanya.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful paper and very a clarifying response. So my questions about this analogy between the transcendental logic and general logic in the theoretical philosophy, and how we can, use this to understand the Kant's practical philosophy, or project in practical philosophy. So one worry I have is that the transcendental logic is obviously focuses on the particular faculties that we have. And in that respect, so it limits our cognition. So it's about what humans can cognize and know or experience. And yet, so the answer is kind of specific to humans. But when we talk about the practical philosophy, it seems like Kant wants to give us a universal answer and say that, these laws are not just valid for humans, but it's also they're valid for God, even although not in the form of a command, right? So that has that kind of universality that so just to point out in this analogy, it seems here that in the practical realm, it seems like he's talking about a general rational willing on evolution, as opposed to a human kind of, so how would you, do you see it as a problem, or so how would you respond to that, this analogy? Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks for the remark. I mean, one first response that I would give is, well, also in theoretical philosophy, in fact, it's about how finite rational beings cognize something, not how about how rational beings in general, without, well, what do we know about the feature of sensibility of other beings, or something like that? I mean, it's not about humans specifically, I should say. It's about finite rational beings, precisely in the same way that moral philosophy is about finite rational beings. Of course, what we are trying to understand to Kant's eyes is, in both cases, of course, well, you're right in pointing out that analogies can be risky in a way, and God knows if Kant knew about how risky they were, because it draws analogies all the time, and sometimes later he grows dissatisfied with that and draws another analogy, and so on and so on. But still, they have to be, well, handled with some care, of course, with some caution. But in this case, we can apply caution without being too worried about that as far as I see the matters. Namely, I mean, both in the theoretical case and the moral case, we are trying to identify and ground norms for, well, for the activity, for the cognitive and moral activity of finite rational beings in both cases. And it's in both cases about understanding how, well, pure structures are in synergy and determine also, well, the empirical use of the same faculties. So, I mean, you're right in pointing out we should use some caution here, but how Kant understands transcendental logic, as far as I know, can be actually seen as, well, as the way Kant understands transcendental logic in the mid-80s, we should say, because those remarks are very specifically bound to a specific step in Kant's development on those matters. Probably he would have said the same things in a different way a bit later. But in both cases, also in transcendental logic, the issue is to clarify how a priori structures, pure structures of our faculties can determine the content and the validity of the empirical use of those faculties. And I mean, where's the important difference after that?
So do you think that the categorical imperative then only valid for limited rational beings, not for example, God?
Well,
it seems like he wants to say that it is valid for God, but not, it just doesn't take the form of a command. And then it seems like he's appealing to a kind of a will that is not of a particular kind as well.
Okay, you're right, but I mean, in fact, it is Kant who says that in categorical imperative, as an imperative, is only valid for finite rational beings, not for God, of course, because it would be like an imperative. It's plain and simple. And of course, the only way, but your point is obviously more refined than that, namely, the only way we have to bring that general principle into focus is to, well, starting from our perspective of finite rational beings, well, to focus on the pure standard that we have. Of course, in relation with our finite condition, it does yield imperatives and commands, but via that, because, well, then the difference via that is we can cognize in some way, I wouldn't like to specify at the moment, in some way a principle whose validity goes beyond, of course, finite rational, but that's a different part, of course. The method and the entire point in those paragraph, in that paragraph in the preface is, of course, first about method. The method we are interested in at the moment is how we can identify, how we can find out those principles. And should we just begin from rational willing in general? Not so much. We should begin from, well, pure willing specifically. Then, of course, that doesn't have to let us forget that pure willing for us, well, has to deal with empirical matters and empirical conditions and so on and so on. But still, it remains pure willing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Further questions. If you have questions, please use the raise hand function on Zoom. And if it's not working, just tell me. Kari.
Yes. Thanks, Stefano, for the paper. I really liked it. I think it's very clear. I have a few comments, and as you know, it's not really my subject. So I think that for this reason, I'm particularly interested in the analogy between the theoretical and the practical part. But I also wanted to mention that for those like me who are not that familiar with either, the details of Kant's practical philosophy or the pre-Kantian versions of universal practical philosophy, maybe it might be helpful to start with a short section where you summarize, as it were, the main tenets of this universal practical philosophy. So maybe it will be a bit difficult in your case because you take it to be something general and not just to be, a reference to Wolff's instantiation of universal practical philosophy. But maybe it is also in line with Natalia's suggestion, maybe Wolff is a relevant instantiation of universal practical philosophy, so could be adduced as a kind of example. Yeah, because I think that if the reader has a kind of clear idea as to the content and or method of universal practical philosophy, then it will also be easier to understand what exactly is new in Kant's project. So, but that's just a matter of clarification, in fact. Yeah. So, but then as said, I wanted to ask you something about this analogy between the theoretical and the practical realm that has already been discussed, and my question is basically, well, how far do you think this analogy can be taken? I'm very sympathetic to the more general assumption that Kant operates a lot with analogies, also with analogies between the various parts of his work. And I think that this is simply part of the, or simply an effect of the fact that Kant wants to be a systematic philosopher. Yeah, so what applies in the one context must in a way also apply to the other context. Yeah, in terms of architectonic. So I think there are good reasons to assume that the analogies go pretty far. So you mentioned a few points, like Kant's criticism of the merely descriptive nature of universal practical philosophy, his idea that the groundwork should focus more on the acts carried out by human subject, and the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. And I think I have an idea as to how these various elements are connected in the case of transcendental philosophy. But to me, it was not very clear to me how you think that these various innovative elements that Kant introduces are connected. Yeah, so I think that a kind of very clear distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori aspects of willing, it's clear that Kant wants to focus on the a priori elements, so he has to get rid of the a posteriori elements. And I personally think that in the case of the theoretical philosophy, Kant focuses on the cognitive activities carried out by the human mind, because this allows him to identify a criterion for valid cognition proper. Yeah, because he investigates all these various activities in order to make a claim as to why objective cognition requires intuition and imagination and etc. And so I was wondering if the same applies to the practical context. That is to say that the reason for Kant's focus on cognitive acts serves the purpose of establishing the criterion for moral actions. So maybe it's different, yes, but I was wondering how far you want to push the analogies. That's the more general part of my question. And the second part is how you think that in the practical context, the various elements that you point out as innovative elements are connected.
Many thanks, Karin. Really, many thanks for your comments. In fact, I was especially interested in your reaction or your impression of the paper, because I rather eventually, in a way, in working on that, I recognize some, well, analogy, not between different realms, but between your interests in some parts of Kant theoretical philosophy and some specific issues, and my interest in corresponding issues in practical philosophy. So I'm really happy to hear what you think of it. So let's see what I can respond to your questions. Well, you're totally right, and I shouldn't say it once more, but in a longer version of the paper, there is a short introduction about what universal practical philosophy is, of course, because I know that not everyone, weird as it may seem, not everyone reads Wolff every day, and not especially not the German ethics or the Latin stuff. I mean, I don't see why, but it appears it is so. But you're totally right, and of course, well, I with all my or in spite of all my emphasis or not being Wolff the only target. Well, of course, Wolff is the main figure, is the inventor, is who christens the discipline, as everyone recognizes, and so on. So he is not the only target, but is, of course, part of the target. So you're totally right. We can, well, at least clarify or give a sort of short blueprint of what Wolff aims to do. Well, interestingly, that as an aside, Baumgarten's case, which everyone working on Kant by now knows how important Baumgarten was to Kant, both in metaphysics and in practical philosophy. It's already interesting that Baumgarten's case is different, because is Philosophia Practica Prima, is first practical philosophy, which he presents as, well, universal practical philosophy, just by another name, does have a different outline than Wolff, but that's an aside. More interesting, or more into the proper questions. How far does the analogy go? That is one very important point, and this is, of course, well, to go back to what I said a minute ago. That's part of the problem in dealing with this way that Kant has to not just to present his own views, but to work out his own views. As you know, many times he gives the impression that via the analogy he works out some new claim, or he specifies some new some specific view, and so on and so on. So it's always a matter of well, a certain balance about, well, having certain caution in using the analogy, or in following, to be more precise, the analogy, and brave enough or careful enough to, well, follow the analogy as far as you can. In this case, I do think that the analogy can go, or is meant to go, pretty deep. I mean, and not only, I mean, one first very important reason is, of course, what you anticipate, namely, it's about sketching and working out a system of philosophy. And so we from the outset, and we know Kant is a systematic mind, not only a systematic philosopher. He works by thinking systematically, by framing issues systematically. So you're totally right about that. I mean, every time we have the impression that that claim A is also worked out by thinking that it would correspond, or it could correspond to a analogous claim A star in, well, another part of philosophy. And so the resulting system would that claim would yield at that point would look in that way, and so on and so on. And that also explains, to my mind, why we find in Kant so many, it's crazy how many there are, so many systematical sketches, which are every time, well, overcome and corrected and jettisoned and totally, rethought, and so on and so on. Okay, but there's one even deeper reason to me why the analogy should be understood as going rather deep. Well, it's the unity of reason, of course. It's the presupposition of the unity of reason, and the passage I was calling attention to in that draft of the Prolegomena about the auffallende Ähnlichkeit, the striking similarity, is motivated by the idea, by the underlying idea of the unity of reason. Of course, also, again, we all know that the unity of reason is, for Kant, both an all-important presupposition and an impossible issue to deal with. Well, it's basically, as you, well, I'm not saying anything further about the unity of reason, to be fair, but still, as far as the analogy between theoretical philosophy and moral philosophy is concerned, well, the analogy is supposed to go pretty deep. Namely, I mean, the very idea which Kant, the very idea that the foundations of metaphysics and the foundations of moral philosophy should be construed analogously, namely via the thought that both have to clarify how synthetic claims a priori are possible, is extremely powerful, of course. A further point that I can possibly discuss either in the paper or today is, why those terms are not that present in the following works, not as prominent as they are in the Prolegomena and in the groundwork. But that's matter for another day, I suppose. But I should think that if we understand the analogy, or, well, why the analogy? Probably the homology properly, it should be meant to go pretty far, of course. While on the other hand, we shouldn't forget. I mean, think of the second critique. The second critique grows out suddenly, in totally unforeseen, precisely out of the same order of considerations, in a way, and precisely out of the consideration that pure reason, specifically pure reason, not reason in general, again, follows roughly the same dynamics, operates roughly according to the same structures and a priori features and a priori norms, and therefore should be examined, well, in the same way in both cases. Then, of course, at the same time, the second critique is in a way clearer than the groundwork in this respect, because it makes that underlying homology much more prominent and much more explicit, but at the same time underscores almost every page, this analogy, what is specific about moral cognition, about practical determination, and so on and so on. So Kant, well, recognizes rather quickly, of course, that, well, the analogy on the one hand goes really deep, but on the other hand should be followed blindly, of course, as roughly, well, an application, or just by projecting the results of one examination onto the other, of course. It just, well, the same criteria, the same methodological criteria apply in both cases, of course. Speaking of criteria, your last point, or second to last point, was about a priori and a posteriori, and it's a very large question, which I thank you for, but I'm not sure I can give an entirely satisfying response to that. But in general, I think at that point, at that level, and specifically at that level, the homology is in fact helpful to the commentator, because, well, but that's matter for a different paper, not an hypothetical paper, a different paper of mine. We should understand also, because of his reaction, his, well, distance from universal practical philosophy, we should understand Kant's own novel approach to the foundations of moral philosophy, also in precisely analogous terms as those you mentioned before, namely in the terms of an approach who aims at, well, finding out and establish a fundamental standard by examining not just practical acts in general, or rational agency, but, well, specifically operations of moral judgment. That is what matters, and that is what explains actually how the groundwork starts in the first section. It's not about examining how willing operates in general. It's about examining how the will gives us a standard we already employ, already follow in our everyday moral judgments. And in this case, well, it's the difficulty is that you have to examine and analyze different operations of the mind, or of reason, to be more Kantian. But it is still about examining and analyzing by focusing on their a priori features, operations of reason. So in this sense, and this is probably the most crucial methodological point in Kant's general outlook, as far as I see. In this sense, the analogy is complete to my mind. But I would like to hear more from you about this, of course.
Well, maybe another time. So I'm sure there will be other questions. Yes, but thanks for your answer. I thought it was very interesting. Yeah, and I agree about the depth of the analogy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this fascinating discussion. Further questions?
I think Natalia wanted to respond.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, then Natalia, if you want to respond to Stefano's response.
It's just a couple of really small,
okay.
I won't sort of go on about this, but you mentioned sort of to one of my points about why Kant explicitly mentions just Wolf and the writers of that discipline. Well, you said sort of how clear can he be, right, or something like that. My point was that, you know, if we take from that discussion of Kant's the very general anti-constitutivist point, right? That point doesn't just apply to universal practical philosophy, and that's why I mentioned the ancients. It also applies to them. So if he really wants to make that general point, why just talk about Wolff and the right, universal practical philosophy? So that was about that. And just another small point about the paradox of method discussion. You mentioned maybe it's a different aspect, a different task that Kant has there, but I sort of think that there Kant is also laying out the only method that will get you to even discover the fundamental principles of morality and will allow you to ground it. So it seems very similar to me. It doesn't seem to me like it's a very, that different. And there has to be a connection. And I think I can even sort of see what the connection is roughly, because those people who start with agency or with action, for example, right? They say, okay, so what is action in general? It must have some constitutive aim, right? Well, how do we define this constitutive aim? And if we define it in substantive terms, right, drawing on empirical psychology or something like that, that Kant got you. You can't get out of that. That's the problem, right? But some of these contemporary constitutivists, so right, I think it's a very similar kind of point against the, how you can and cannot derive moral principles or validate moral principles. And it all comes down to this constitutive aim and how we think about it. And I guess, yeah, I'm not fully convinced that some of these contemporary constitutivists, Kantian constitutivists, that they would be impugned by that, because they're not looking at the constitutive aim of agency, for example, or constitutive aim of activity of, let's say, reason, as Schaeffer does, in any kind of substantive terms. It's right. So yeah.
No, thanks. Again, you're totally right, and you recall me to refer me back to a couple of things I wasn't that I just didn't mention, if only because I'm feeling all the time that I'm talking too much. First, about the ancients, you're right. I forgot to say anything about that. I believe there are a few reasons why the ancients were not relevant, or to be more precise, not felt by Kant as relevant at that place. Because, the first more contextual reason is that you have to, when you begin, or you intend to begin a new philosophical project, you have first to clarify what your relation to the competition is.
Right.
It's not entirely or not primarily important to say what your relation to Aristotle is. It's probably more important to say what your relation to, Korsgaard is, if you're writing now. And if you're writing in the 1780s, it's probably more important, if only because the risk of someone misconstruing your intent, your aims, is of course greater. And that's the first more contextual, in a way, if you want, more superficial point, but still important to my mind. Second reason, and as you know, Kant had not only probably limited knowledge of ancient moral philosophy, but had a very specific idea about its general outlook. Namely, ancient moral philosophy was only about giving substantial views about what the highest good is. And he says that, he repeats that all the time. So it's not about, ancient moral philosophy is not about, to clarify what faculty of the mind allows us to cognize moral principles. Well, it's not even about moral principles. So it does feel to me that at least in Kant's eyes, I'm not saying that Aristotle or Aristotle mainly couldn't be relevant in that respect, but in Kant's eyes, once again, speaking of Aristotle, I mean, to us, it wouldn't be that much the Nicomachean ethics relevant. It would be rather the De Anima relevant. And Kant's point is precisely that his contemporaries, not other philosophers or the ancient, for instance, did envisage the project of an examination of the faculties of the mind involved in agency. In this sense, I'm inclined to understand that Kant never even thought of including the ancients in that critical point, which is, and this is also an important difference. I mean, I'm emphasizing that those remarks have a very wide, very broad significance, but they are not, well, that significance is still not as wide as, say, the anti-consequentialist point and the second critique on in the groundwork, namely all previous moral philosophers, both ancients and moderns, were following or just making explicit the principle of heteronomy. It's not that general, the point against universal practical philosophy. Second question, more precisely, about the paradox of method. You're right, of course. The 2 points, the 2 critical remarks have to be related in a way. And the most sensible thing to say about this is precisely what you just said, namely, if I try to ground moral philosophy via universal practical philosophy, I'm bound to, well, just define good in terms of the object of will in general. And that would lead us to the general problem of the so-called guise of the good thesis, which many people ascribe to Kant, and I, with other colleagues, argue at the opposite, that Kant doesn't ascribe to that, doesn't subscribe to that, precisely for, well, also because of some of the reasons I mentioned here. So if you are doing universal practical philosophy, you are bound to, well, make precisely the mistake that the paradoxical method is meant to address and avoid, of course. But it doesn't mean the other way around, that if you are doing that mistake, namely, if you are trying to ground moral philosophy in general, moral normativity, if you want, in general, by a substantial view of the good, that doesn't mean that if you're trying to do that, you have to do universal practical philosophy. You can do that by other theoretical means, I suppose. For instance, like the ancient did.
Right, but but the connection, ancients also had the descriptive exercise, right? Descriptive and analytic exercise. You know, what's good for human beings, like let's look at happiness, or let's look at pleasure, let's look at social life, let's look at this and this. And so there is a descriptive analytic exercise on which is supposed to find what the object of the will is, and then let's figure out what principles are there that would bring us, or would promote that. So I think the structure is similar.
To me, precisely because of what you just said, the structure is precisely the opposite, because you're starting by a descriptive account what is good, what the good is, and by that you derive in a way what willing or actually moral willing in that sense would be, and not the other way around. Universal practical philosophy does that.
Aristotle starts Nicomachean Ethics by saying every action, every desire aims at some good. So he's defining a constitutive aim of action, right? So it's acting. So anyway, I mean, we could, yeah.
Natalia, I think you should write an article on this subject and defend your view as to the role of the ancients in Kant's account. And maybe we can discuss it a year from here. We can discuss it.
Yeah. For now, I'll stop about the
and we invite Stefano to respond.
Exactly.
And in the meantime, we can give you as a present a tentative title for the paper, namely Aristotle as the first author in universal practical philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
It does sound good.
Right. Right.
Very good.
But it's interesting that there are a lot of these writers, so Schaeffer in particular, I think there is a connection to Aristotle, to a kind of a constitutivist reading of Aristotle as well. So just to draw that little connection.
In that respect, again, you're totally right. I mean, but this again goes back to Korsgaard, which who has stressed every time, every possible time, even when it wasn't relevant, that Kant could be read or should be read in some analogy or in connection with Aristotle. And basically every time I'm of the opposite view. I mean, it's not that I'm more authoritative than Korsgaard, of course, but I'm never convinced. I don't think that Kant was an Aristotelian in moral philosophy in any possible sense.
Because he was a Stoic, I believe.
I do know that you maintain something like that. That would yield further questions and clarifications. I believe we even talked briefly about that at some point in some occasion. That would require you to make much more precise than it usually is what a Stoic is. And you can give basically 15 possible different.
Sure.
Okay, so thank you so much for this fascinating talk, great answers, and all the discussion. It was a very productive session. Thank you everyone, and we'll meet again next week for a talk on Schelling's Aids of the Word, and see you soon then.
Thanks very much, everyone.